the importation story was used by Llewellyn to justify to explain the evidence up until a certain point where he backed down and said that, and the story has since changed where the minister does not use it at all. Why do you reckon?
I've no idea. Look, he's. Well, I suppose firstly we have to sort of clarify is the minister knows what he gets told. So someone told him whatever it was initially. So back in 2000, there was some evidence, some information, and he was given the opportunity to be able to make a decision on the basis that failure to do something may be more catastrophic than saying that we can deal with the situation as it is. So the Peter Williams desire was to deal with it as it is, which was, as Peter Williams so beautifully said one time, there's a problem with foxes because people are going out and looking for them. Rangers are going out and looking for foxes. We have a task force that's going to go and look for foxes. They're going to find stuff. If we have no one looking, we don't have a problem. So Llewellyn is told that there could be foxes. Failure to do something about foxes will be a catastrophic result. He's then got to manage that against doing nothing. If there are no foxes, there will be no catastrophic result. Or start an investigation and see what is there and then work out the next bit. So part of the evidence for having a task force is there has been an importation. Now, without an importation, you really don't have a stimulus to act. You've got a footprint. You've got a fox shot by somebody who we'll describe as an unreliable witness. No, you've got a dead animal carcass that's got allegedly got an endemic animal in it. So that's what you've got, and you've got sightings. That wouldn't lead necessarily to a task force, I'd suggest. That would lead to gathering more evidence and perhaps selecting a couple of individuals to gather that evidence, and you might be very particular about who you chose. So in government you choose people to gather that evidence who are competent because that's the result you want, or you choose some idiots and you get the result that Peter Williams wanted, but nothing gets found. So you choose some competent people and you go gather more evidence. If you've got some certainty, and at the time there was some certainty that foxes had been brought in a concerted effort and then released over a number of years. All of the evidence for the establishment of a species like fox in a new environment would indicate that that should be successful. So the introduction of foxes into Australia followed a fairly similar sort of process. It required multiple introductions of adult animals, thereabouts, and it required you to control the predators of them. But the multiple introductions, that's what gets you established or not. So you would form a task force on the basis of that. At that time, that was very important in my estimation and the recommendation that I made that a task force should be formed. If that had not happened, then I certainly wouldn't have recommended forming a task force of the nature that did get formed.
The other thing is, if you've got a founding event like that and you can glean the details of where they were released, how many there were, the sex, the age, that has got to be, I mean, crucial to mapping or to modelling what your population is going to do. So why was it pretty much dismissed, and why wasn't that work done?
Oh, well, there wasn't there was certainly no desire by the senior management in Parks to do. I mean, really, I'm talking about the general manager. He didn't have a desire to do that. That wasn't a primary driver for him. For whatever reason, there were other things that were more important to him. It wasn't. And he was the man who makes the decisions in the department. The minister can tell that person what to do, provided they've either got independent advice or they can make up their own mind. Now, it would appear that he was getting lots of advice from a whole range of different sources, because that's the nature of politics in Tasmania, is anybody can ring up the minister because they probably went to school with him. They certainly did if they own a lot of land. They probably do because it's such a closed environment anyway. So he, Llewellyn had a good reason for doing this, because the evidence was that there were multiple releases. There wasn't evidence that that wasn't the case. So at the time, I would consider at the time he made the right decision to have a task force. Did he have the right people in the task force? Well, I'm not sure about that in retrospect, and at the time I sort of wondered about it as well. The task force wasn't given the power to be able to do the things that was necessary to deal with that incursion event. So we're going to say the incursion event was true. If it was true, there were steps that should have been taken that weren't at the time. And I'd suggest it's because there wasn't a desire within senior management for that to occur. So a really simple thing to do, and one of the fellows who ran the sort of the chemical standards branch, the people who dealt with 1080 in Tasmania, and it was a really very, very good suggestion. Do a broad scale rabbit baiting program. Rabbits are an excellent. They're like little pieces of bait spread across the landscape in a random manner, and that could be done legally right there at that time. What couldn't be done legally right there at that time was run a broad-scale fox baiting program, because there was no registered bait for Tasmania. There was no processes or procedures that they had, let alone anything they felt that they were comfortable with. So although it's very obvious what needed to be done there was a very intensive and very broad-scale program, they didn't have it set up to do that. They had no processes. It then took them months, and I was involved in that, of getting baits registered and getting up a training program in order to be able to do these things. But the simple thing that could have occurred right straight away was run a broad-scale, let's call it a broad-scale rabbit baiting program. You could call it a broad-scale possum baiting program. I certainly enjoy doing that in Tasmania at the time, and use them as the opportunity for secondary poisoning for foxes. But there was also this desire not to do things that would cause some upset with other sections within the community who don't like 1080, who needed to be on side to do your latter program of broad-scale 1080 baiting for foxes. So at that point too, there was also the start of negotiations with the green part of politics and the conservation groups to try and get them on side to the concept of doing broad-scale fox baiting. So
surprisingly happened.
Well, it did, it happened because there was a lot of work and a lot of time spent lobbying those groups, and really talking some fairly basic sense, and listening to what they had to say and what their concerns as well were. So that, to that extent, that was a pretty good program. It was just months late.
Yeah. Are you familiar with Jack Kinnear's report?
Yes. Yeah.
How was that received?
Chris Ems and I and Nick and might have been some others involved, were part of the process of commissioning Jack to do that. And the purpose of doing that was to get his opinion, because he's an expert in his field in Australia, and certainly an expert in West Australia. And the government necessarily, and there, we can say the minister, didn't really take it on as we'll now do the things that Jack said. Certainly within the task force they took it on like that.
Are you aware that it was rewritten about 7 or 8 times because they didn't like what was in it?
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised by that.
He pretty much just threw his hands in the air by the end of it.
Yeah, look, I remember I only had a couple of discussions with Jack, and he's pretty much straight down the line, and he was very much at the time informing us that action must be taken immediately, it must be broad scale, and must be intense.
Which it wasn't.
Which it wasn't.
Yeah.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
So where did your connection with the task force end? What point?
I ended in December, I think it was 2001, was it?
I don't know, probably.
I don't remember now.
Yeah. And Peter Williams was still in charge at the time?
Yeah, he was, yeah.
How much do you know about the staff that were employed at the time? There's been criticisms that they weren't necessarily chosen on merit, more so if they had a gun licence and knew someone.
Oh, look, by that sort of, well, there was actually some quite good people in the task force at that point, and the fellow who was finished up in sort of running, Chris Ems, an extremely competent officer. They certainly had constrictions on them. My understanding was, and I could be wrong about this because he never said it to me directly, was that the minister did want to have people who were involved in shooting groups in the task force. He wanted the impression that shooting was part of the program. I made numerous suggestions that it pretty much a waste of time, and although it appears the first fox might have been shot in Tasmania, the last fox will never be, and all the ones in between won't. And now you could say, well, that's true because they haven't shot any, have they? That's because there's none there.
The hunters don't see them.
Well, I've had experience of some Tasmanian hunters, and they're not that good at it. I've had experience of hunters in different places, and most people really do think they're much better than what they actually are.
There were some issues at the time. They got a bit of a reputation as just being cowboys. They went out there and they weren't really taking it seriously. There were a lot of complaints from the public about the misbehaviour.
Look, I'm not terribly surprised that there would be those sorts of complaints. Why people don't complain about others in Tasmania going and shooting the shit out of paddy melon walrus and brush-tailed possums, I don't quite understand. That seems to be a sport, which is an acceptable behaviour. So that these fellows might carry on in the same manner would make them objects of ridicule.
Did you ever get a sense that the people at the Parks and Wildlife Ranges were a bit too close to the hunters who were a bit dodgy, the poachers and stuff? Oh,
look, I'd be surprised if they weren't. The difference between a policeman and a criminal is one's made a choice to become a policeman. That wildlife officers know poachers, well, they should, because that's who they're trying to catch. They live in small rural communities. It'd be really surprising if they don't know poachers. It'd be really surprising if that they don't know poachers who they might be friends with. It'd be really surprising if some of them never done any poaching in their life. I don't find that's surprising at all. It's their relationship with that person, whether they know them or not, whether they've been to a barbecue where they were also there and they barbecued poached fallow deer. I'd be terribly surprised by that as well. It's the way in which they behave together. That's the issue. Wildlife officers would use poachers for information in order to catch someone else. What poachers do is like all criminals, is they want not to get caught, and they will put somebody else in so that they don't get caught and try and curry some favour with that officer so they don't get done. That's a pretty that's just the way it works. Now, how ethical that officer is, well, that's something which I don't think I'd be able to judge.
Speaking of poachers, the Bosworth fox, were you around at the time of that?
Yeah.
You would have looked at his statement, what he said happened. Does that add up to you?
Oh, I thought the statement that he had was pretty rambling. He certainly appeared to. There may be some bits of truth in there. There's maybe some bits that were made up, and there may be some poor recollections of what occurred. I necessarily didn't see that his behaviour was that unusual.
One thing that I've interviewed him, and his story's the same, and
that is true. That is true.
It's a long time since it happened.
Yeah.
But one thing I can't get my head around is that at 50 yards away with a spotlight on, he didn't know what he was shooting. He said he saw a pair of eyes and couldn't tell what it was. 3 or 4 times magnified by scope. Does that make any sense?
I think that's entirely possible. I told you about the person with the blue Persian cat, thought it was a fox, and they stopped and they looked at it. This is the bit that is no surprise to me, is that he fired at an animal of which he could not be certain what it was. That is no surprise to me at all. That he was that close and still couldn't identify it, that is a bit of a surprise, that he couldn't identify it as being something different to what else he's seen. It wasn't a paddy melon wallaby, it wasn't a giraffe, it wasn't a wombat, it wasn't a cat. I find that difficult to believe, that he's not able to do that he doesn't have those skills, or didn't at that point in time. Now, it might be because he'd had a couple of drinks. I don't know. It might be because he's got cataracts on his eyes. It might be because his scope wasn't clean. I don't know that bit. That he shot at something he could not identify, that is not unusual at all.
Should be. But
lots of people,
I know.
a couple of times this year, people have got shot.
Yep.
Because they did not identify their target prior to pulling the trigger. And on one occasion it was an accident that fell forward or something like that. So there's 3 deaths, 2 where they didn't identify their target prior to pulling the trigger. That is not an unusual behaviour.
The other carcasses have been found, which are referred to as movable evidence because they were dead when they were found. Have you looked into any of them at all, and are you suspicious about them?
No, I don't know that I'm suspicious about them. The one that found at Esk, there were some statements about that it perhaps could have been moved, but it didn't get moved on a plane from Tullamarine. It really doesn't matter that much where it was now, unless someone had it as a pet, kept it in a cage and whatever, some sort of story like that.
Which I've heard.
Yeah, look, this is the nature of it, is that you can construct any story that you like for whatever the purpose is that you want, whether you want to say that it was true or whether you want to denigrate it.
One of the problems that the program has faced, though, and it's a difficult one because some people are fairly obsessive about this, is that often they've had to retract or go back and change the stories that have been official reports. And when things have had the opportunity to have irrefutable evidence to silence the critics, they've botched it. Which is, it sort of leads to this whole public scepticism, basically. I don't think there's a question in that.
No, I'd reasonably suggest it would. I mean, that's what decreased my confidence in the program. If there are things that were said to be irrefutable evidence and then they're found not to be irrefutable, what would really reduce my confidence would be that if that was a story which was made up by an officer for the purposes of making it look irrefutable. If it was that someone took evidence from another person who, say, involved in finding the fox or something like that, and that was incorrectly written down or poorly transcribed or misunderstood, then there's a problem there in the way that evidence was collected. If they were told a lie by somebody who later retracted it, then that's an entirely different thing. So there's the difference between what the officers do and what the informants and or the public do. There's a difference between the way in which the evidence is interpreted and the way in which the evidence is reported.
Yep.
So if there are people who are collecting evidence for the purposes of making the program look good or themselves not look bad, then I think there's a real issue there. If it's that the evidence has been misinterpreted, then perhaps we've got a problem with the way we trained these people. Perhaps we should have had another expert or somebody different look at the evidence. That to me is more of the issue. I'd be very concerned if there were people who are employed within the task force, whether in the past or the present, who have embellished a story for the purposes of making it look better or themselves feel better or getting a headline or something, as against they got it wrong.
Yep. Right. So the concerns that Clive Marks has identified to do with the scat DNA analysis, he wants a review of that, an independent one. What's your opinion?
Oh, that's quite a reasonable thing to do. Yeah, and I'd like to see that sort of review also use some other locations as well, and the Phillip Island would be a good place to do that, because you've got very few places where you have this low density of foxes. So it would be useful to use that and compare it to what's been found in Tasmania. It's an extremely good idea to review. It's extremely good idea to look at the processes and the procedures that have been used and look at the way in which the individuals involved in that process have done it. So they're not causing contamination of it. They're actually doing it in the appropriate manner, because that's the best thing for the program. Because if you find problems in that, then they need to be fixed.
How would you suggest it can be independent?
Well, the first thing that you want to do is you want to find some experts in the field. I would then suggest that why would it be that those people would behave in anything other than a professional manner? Now, some people would say, oh, well, it can't be anybody from the invasive animal CRC because they've got a stake in it. Then, if we're going to create a criteria, the criteria is this individual and or organisation they work for hasn't been working for the task force before, will get no further benefit from it. What would you like to put in that? Well, we form a committee to decide what independence would look like. So you can do that, obviously, and that might be useful. But look, there are, it would be about creating a criteria for what's going to be tested and how it's going to be tested. Then it might be tested by a variety of laboratories, and one of them might be a blind test in another place where they don't know anything about it, and it's tested in Canada or something, or London, or wherever it is. Now, that would be useful, and it will use up some money. Will it give more backing to the program? Not to the people who don't believe it. It won't make any difference. The purpose of it I would suggest, the purpose shouldn't be to see whether whether the foxes there or not by this method. It's whether they've done the method properly. That's what you should look at, and then you might look at doing different things in the field. So it's really difficult to assert the presence of a cryptic species. It's impossible to assert the presence of a species that's not there. So that's the problem that they've got, and I know you will always be able to question
what science is.
The evidence.
Another one of the key points was that because the data looking so strange that's coming back is that if you look at the physical map of evidence, you got 10 years on, oh fuck, it's too late. We can't do anything about it. How can you eradicate a population that is that widely spread?
Well, it wouldn't be possible. It would, well, the evidence is that it's never been done on an island of that size.
It was always given a 3-year time period anyway, so we're 10 years on.
Look, you could suggest that the population is still low and it's still isolated, and there are areas where that might be possible to do. That would seem to be pretty long bow. It's probably more likely that they are isolated populations, but they're self-sustaining. They're already difficult to detect. There's no reason to believe that they won't remain difficult to detect, and there won't be more outliers of these populations establishing. And it would only be a period of time when they become more abundant. Now, the task force can do more broad-scale baiting, more intense baiting. It would again just be a limiter on the population, and it's a very interesting experiment. How long you could do that for, and how long the population would remain at that low level.
One of the problems that comes up is, where does it end?
Well, I've suggested a number of times that you can end it right now. You only have to live with the consequence.
It was suggested to me that a bit of a rebranding could be a good idea, to have, instead of an eradication program, a more sort of a quarantine program, like protecting Tasmania from foxes as opposed to eradicating. And if you ask the man on the street how much the government should spend on that, it's like $5 million is nothing. But unfortunately they're trying to eradicate something that they can't really find, which is a bit of an issue they're up against.
Look, certainly, if they stop doing the baiting programs, foxes should become more abundant. If they do the baiting programs more intensely or over a larger scale, then reasonably they should be able to keep fox numbers where they are, perhaps where they are now. they may be able to lower them in some areas. What is it we try to do in the mainland? We try to lower fox numbers down to a density where the native species can recover. So the programs that have been done in Western Australia, the programs that are done at Shark Bay, that are done on Phillip Island, that are done in East Gippsland, are all about reducing fox numbers down to a level where you can get a response in the species that are being protected. That's been demonstrated in Western Australia. It's been demonstrated on some islands as well, that you get this response and the animals become more abundant. When can you stop that fox control? You can't, ever. In order to have a program that enabled native species in Tasmania to remain abundant in the same sort of distributions and densities that they are, then maybe what they're doing is doing that. They've kept foxes down to a threshold where they're not impacting upon native species. Now, the question would be, are they being monitored, the native species that would be at most at risk from foxes, are they being monitored to see what changes in their populations that are occurring that could have been attributed to foxes? That would be a very useful thing to do.
I have a feeling it's being done.
It is being done.
I think so. I think there is a lot of monitoring going on.
And that's a good thing.
Species, yes.
Yeah, because
for
then
if there are changes,
then if you take the foot off the pedal, then foxes start to increase. You should see a decline, and you would know that the intensity of effort that you were doing before appeared to be sufficient. So that's the biggest question in fox management, is at what level must you keep that population down to? Now, some people would suggest that level is 0, and if you're not able to do that, then you just simply try to do it as low a level as you possibly can. So that means you don't stop, obviously. You don't stop, and you don't stop anywhere. So in England, in order to reduce fox numbers for the purposes of increasing numbers of game birds, the English system is basically, you've got gamekeepers and people who work on estates for the purpose of controlling foxes and increasing their game numbers. The amount of money spent on fox management for that purpose in England is £55 million. That was quite a few years ago. So England's about the size of Victoria. Tassie's a bit smaller. So we're looking at whatever it is, you can work out the figures, but maybe it's £10 million or £15 million, $30 or $40 million or something like that, in order to be able to do it. So they currently run the program at what? I don't know, $5 million? $5 million? That's a good investment. That's a good investment if what it's doing is keeping the population low enough to enable native species to survive. Question still remains, are they there?
Yeah.
So what would irrefutable evidence look like?
Well,
which is a question.
2 scats from the same fox would be, no.
I could arrange that with a phone call if you like.
Well, yes, this is true.
So that won't be...
When they have found carcasses, they haven't found scats from the fox in the vicinity.
Mm-hmm.
That would be
Yep.
fairly compelling
Yep.
if that was the case.
Okay, again, I could arrange that.
Oh, yeah.
So I've asked Ivor Dean, and I've asked Mr. Obendorf and some of the other skeptics. I've asked them in the newspapers some years ago, you provide the criteria for irrefutable evidence. And they haven't got it. Because it could all be done. It could all be hoaxed.
Just on hoaxes, there have been publicised hoaxes, and one thing that I've never really understood is why these people were not in any way punished or made an example of. They were never charged. I know there's been given legal reasons why charging would be difficult. But the fact that these people did these hoaxes, got away with it, had a laugh, and never got into any trouble. And sometimes those hoaxes got mixed in with the physical evidence. It's not good.
No, it's not at all. No.
That happened a bit early on, and
Yeah, it did. There was numerous. I mean, it appeared to be a sport at one point in time there, hoaxing the task force. Much enjoyed by columnists and cartoonists.
why do you think these people weren't made examples of?
I'm not sure. You know, there appeared to be a reluctance to follow those cases through, and it may be, and I'm just thinking of what it was like at the time, it was more important, and if this is clearly a hoax, it's more important to deal with what appears to be evidence. Let's go and investigate that, and forget about the hoax.
Yep.
The task force wasn't resourced sufficiently to be able to deal with investigation of hoaxes and follow it up.
It is a public perception thing though, which is very important because they need community support.
Yeah. But if you look at if we take on as reasonable evidence at the time that people had brought foxes into Tasmania and had deliberately released them, let's take that on as being true. The next steps don't appear to be a sufficient commitment to give you confidence that you would eradicate foxes. And there wasn't a commitment to do that. It didn't look like that commitment. It didn't have the resources that would fulfil that type of commitment. Why? You'll have to ask the people who made the decisions about the resourcing for that one.
I'm trying.
I'd suggest they were trying to walk a line between, if I do nothing, oh my goodness, it will go really bad. I do something, it will look like I'm doing something. I won't be criticised because I didn't do something, but I think it might be a hoax. People are ringing me up. People I know are telling me, oh, it's not true, David. It didn't really happen. But I've got this other advice that says, well, it has happened and it'll look like this down the road. So I'll do a bit, as much as I can within this current budget that the department's got, and then if there's some more evidence, we'll go this way or we'll go that way.
Do you know much about the applications for funding at the time? Because there was issues, especially when I think it was Robert Hill who sort of just laughed at them and said this isn't an application, this isn't a serious proposal, and they sent it back about 3 or 4 times.
Yeah. The Hill seemed to be having some sort of pitch battle with Llewellyn at the time, and there was some sort of pissing on post game that they were playing. He was trying to be the boss and tell the state government what they'd do and what they wouldn't do, and this issue just got caught up with that. It got caught up with other things related to natural heritage areas, and which you might say is unfortunate, but the federal government was of no help at all. They were just...
Well, the NH2 was always just a bloody pork barrelling exercise anyway.
Yeah.
We've covered most. Is there anything else that's pretty similar? I'm really interested in the early days because I'm having trouble getting people to talk about that, especially the small town culture where you see no evil. You were on the ground at the time. How was your impression of the community in Longford when these things were going on?
My feeling was that they felt they had all been tarred by a brush for things which they had no part in. It wasn't their fault. That there might have been an individual or individuals within that community that were not very nice, and didn't have anything to do with Longford. There were just some people who were like that, and they'd all got tarred with that. My feeling in Tasmania at that time was that there was very significant levels of distrust in rural Tasmania against government. For whatever reasons, there wasn't very much trust there at all. Wildlife officers were particularly not liked. Nature Conservation Branch were very particularly not liked in rural communities. And look, that doesn't mean that everyone in a rural community held that view, but the loud voices were the ones of upset of government and upset of the way in which wildlife officers handled themselves and behaved. And there were some rogues and cowboys in that. And on the other side of the fence there were some rogues and cowboy farmers and some rogues and cowboy bloody poachers as well. So there was definitely very little trust there. It was very much an us and them culture.
Yeah.
I attended a number of public meetings where we were there to inform people of what was happening and what was the intent, and they were hostile environments.
I've spoken, well, about the only person I've spoken to from Longford is Peter Dark, who said to say good day.
Yep.
But he's very much on the ground. He knows everyone,
he does.
Game,
Yep.
And he was great. But when I got to asking him about this incident, he wouldn't say anything, and he wouldn't even speculate. And I found it very difficult to believe that he wouldn't know all the details. Is that just a small town culture thing, do you think?
Well, he lives there.
Yeah.
And he intends to live there for a fair bit longer. He certainly intends to, I suspect he intends to live in Tasmania for a while, whether he's going to live in that place or not. Tasmania is a very small place. And Peter I found him a very straight shooter. He will tell you what you need to know, and he'll tell you what he believes he could trust you with. And I think that's probably pretty reasonable, because he's got to live in that environment. Now, what he knows, he may know some scuttlebutt.
Yeah.
Right? Now, that's all fine if you and I and a few other blokes are sitting around having a piss up. We're going to go, oh yeah, he did that, oh that bastard, she did that. That's fine.
Yeah.
Right? Amongst us. And even in that conversation, there are things that we won't say because of someone being there. So what he says to you is not going to come across like we're all sitting around having a piss up. It's going to come across as he said this about that person, and there it is on the television screen.
My main point, I totally understand what you're saying, you're right. This is such a serious incident. I mean, the ramifications are just enormous.
Yeah.
Fortunately, they don't seem to have taken. But this is something that Bosworth came out with as well. He said, oh, I know where there's another fox, but I'm not going to tell you. And this was after he just told me about what a devastating thing the whole the foxes in Tasmania is. But they go to the ground when they're asked about details.
Well, as you've already indicated, one of the things is that people get other information, and that causes them to question what they've been told previously, or to better understand what they've been told previously and prove what they already know. So if I know something which someone told me, that's not necessarily going to be evidence in court. So I might repeat it to you on the basis of I reasonably understand this to be the case, but that's still not going to be sufficient for proving the case. So there's, the bit between scuttlebutt and truth is I think I know this to be the case, but I wasn't there at that time. I didn't observe that, and this is not my first-hand account. This is what someone else told me, and I believe that person, but I'm not sure his source. So, look, it's not a Royal Commission. This is not sworn evidence. So, when the Royal Commission turns up, then the evidence may be slightly different.
Yep. Just one more thing, which you mentioned the story about foxes being kept in Burnie. Where did you learn about that?
That was at pretty much sort of the same time that we were gathering more evidence about what we believed had occurred at Longford. There were some reportings of foxes at Burnie, and they were investigated, and a story came back that foxes had been released there by some persons, but independent of these others. And round about that same sort of time period as well.
That was connected to the photograph at Wynyard?
No, the photograph of Wynyard was referred. It was found. That was found earlier than this evidence of people releasing foxes at Burnie. So that was reported. That was reported earlier on, and then there was the information that some persons had been involved in that.
Was there a connection?
I don't know. Look, the person who was involved, had the photo. They wouldn't say anymore. Here's a photo. This is a photo of a fox at Wynyard in the what was it, a pine forest or something.
Yeah.
That's it. That's the end of the story.
And do you remember the reason she gave?
Oh, no, I can't remember.
We've talked about Peter Williams, who sacked her husband.
Oh, right, was that it? Was
Yep.
it?
She said that in the newspaper. She said, I'm not helping that guy.
Yeah.
Like crap.
Yeah. Look, I'm not, that photo of that fox at Wynyard was a photo of an animal that looked like a fox. Was it alive? Was it a stuffed animal? I don't know.
Was it a Wynyard?
Was it at Wynyard? Was it at, Traralgon? Or any place that's got a pine forest? I don't know. And went to Wynyard, looked around Wynyard, went to places that we believe that might look like that photo. Spent a long time, didn't find anywhere that really matched it. But that's pretty hard to do.
Yeah. One of the bits of evidence which has caused quite a few headaches is the scat on Bruny Island. I've asked a lot of people about that, and they all just scratch their heads. I mean,
well, this is what they've got. They've got a scat on Bruny Island that's been tested and it's come up as fox. That's what they've got. That's all they got. That's it. That's it. That's all the evidence there is. Now, in the time that I've been involved in pest animals, in Victoria people believe there's panthers. There is no evidence available that would indicate that that's even close to being true. But what people do is that they take a small bit of information and then they make up the other bit. So the evidence is there's a scat on Bruny Island and we know that scat to be fox. That's all we know. If we then go into, but how could it have got there? We're then making that up. There's only one bit of information we know, and that's the scat was a fox, and it was Bruny Island. That's it. No other evidence available at this point. And you've got nothing else to work to until you find some other evidence.
I'll show that there could be issues with labelling or contamination.
Yeah, indeed.
But we don't know.
But we don't know. So we've only
thing.
got. So there's no. It's a waste of time to speculate on that.
No one knows.
What's useful to do is to investigate the processes and procedures that was used there. To investigate the person who provided the information, if that was the case. Speak to some people that are on the island, the broker who runs the ferry or whatever, in order to gain other information. Otherwise, you don't know anything. You just know about the scat.
There was a bit of controversy recently, I don't know if you've heard about it, about the imported scats which we use for dog training when they weren't quarantined effectively. Is that something that you consider quite, how serious is it?
Well, given what they're trying to do is they've got some public perception of what's occurring, it would be terribly sensible to have logged them in some way. 7 scats were brought in by Officer Smith, and
I said that afterwards once people just...
No, but that would have been a sensible thing to do.
But they weren't treated
but Officer Smith should have kept a diary.
Yeah.
Right?
They weren't frozen to get rid of diseases.
He should have done all those sorts of things, and that's what they should have done. And that to me is a mistake. It's a very important mistake for the public that they've made, and it shows some levels of not thinking about the consequences of those actions. Now, they may reasonably have believed that it was okay to do because they weren't going to do anything with them apart from use them for the dogs.
Perfectly reasonable.
And that's probably exactly their behaviour and thinking, but they really should have thought of the consequences of those actions. So in the task force we wanted to bring some foxes, carcasses and all sorts of things in for a variety of different reasons.
I had Llewellyn signed off on 7 being brought in, and it nearly happened. They were going to be tracked.
Yeah.
There was 7.
Yeah, look, that I was against that because of the public perception. It would have provided some interesting research results, but that's all. But it wouldn't tell you what you wanted to know, which is where did these foxes go? Because the variables are just too many. Dispersal of foxes disperse in any direction, usually at a particular time of the year, but it can be almost at any time during their life cycle. And they disperse at different distances, and sometimes multiple times, so they go one direction, stay for a while, and go another direction. To all intents and purposes, it's a pretty random process, and I think that's the only thing you would ever have found out about it. You just would have found out it was a pretty random process.
Yep.
And forever, the foxes in Tasmania would have been the ones released by the government.
That's what you did.
Yeah. So and my experience with things like radio collars and satellite tracking and all that sort of stuff is it goes wrong.
Oh yeah.
They break. They everything. And you go back to the person who made that collar, who gave you that tracking device, and they go, "Oh, that's never happened before." Well, that's grand, isn't it? Not much use to you now.
From what you know about baiting programs, they're only getting a 90% uptake at the moment with farmers, and I think it's actually going down. It's getting quite serious because people are starting to get coalitions together to stop it.
Yeah.
I mean, how significant is that gap of 10% where they just have to miss?
Well, we'll find that out in time. It's so difficult to know because it's about the area of land is really important, and what's the habitat on that land. Can the land that's been excluded support foxes? Baiting is just simply this: the foxes don't know there's 1080 in there. For them, it's a food source. All we're doing is putting out lots of food sources for the opportunity that individual might take one. If it can't get the opportunity to take that bait, it can't die. So you must put out quality food sources and put them out regularly so to give it a chance to take the bait. If there are areas where there are no baits, there is no opportunity for that fox on that particular piece of land at that time to take the bait. If the program finishes and the fox moves off to where the baiting was previously, then it didn't have a chance to die. Every individual must have the chance to die. That's the simple bit to it.
17% of them are not recovered.
Mm.
I-
That's quite normal.
It's normal.
Yep. Fox baiting programs on the mainland. Foxes remove baits. They cache them. Other animals might remove them as well. They might forget the location of where the bait station was. It's possible too. Bandicoots could move them. Possums could move them. Devils could move them. Bettongs might move them. People might move them. Where an animal's moved a bait, I'm not too worried about that because there's just a chance for the fox to come and take it. Low uptake rates in a low population is very normal.
Well, I think I've covered just about everything. It's great. Thanks.
Yeah, no worries.